Amidst the echoes of vanished civilizations, where empires once clashed like titans upon the anvil of history, there lies a battlefield few remember yet. It may have saved the very soul of the old world dot in the scorching heat of late summer in 1260. In the plains of Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, an unstoppable force met an immovable resistance. The Mongol Empire, the most ferocious war machine the world had ever known, had surged westward like a tidal wave of fire and steel. Cities crumbled, kingdoms bowed, and even the mighty Abbasid Caliphate had been reduced to ash. No army had dared defy the sons of Genghis Khan and lived to tell the tale dot until now. From the shadows of fractured sultanates emerged a hardened warrior caste, Mamluks, once slaves, now kings. Forged in the fires of servitude, they would confront the empire that had shattered the world. The Battle of Ain Jalut was not merely a clash of swords, it was a war for civilization itself. This is the untold epic of resistance against annihilation, of valor born from desperation, of how one battle not only broke the Mongol myth of invincibility, but safeguarded the future of Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and perhaps the very shape of the modern world dot in the vast silence of the Central Asian steppes, where the wind whispers through waist-high grass and snow-laced mountains watch like ancient sentinels. A storm was gathering not of clouds, but of men. The dawn of the 13th century found this brutal, beautiful expanse seemingly unchanged for millennia. Nomadic clans wandered with their herds under a canopy of sky, their lives dictated by seasons, pasture, and blood feud. But beneath this timeless rhythm, tectonic forces stirred. Out of the cold expanse of Mongolia, a man emerged neither king nor noble by birth, but forged in hardship, betrayal, and exile. His name was Temujin. Born around 1162 to the Borjigin clan, Temujin was a child of violence. His father was poisoned by rival Tatars, and his family was cast into poverty by their own tribe. Hunted, starved, and betrayed, Temujin's early life was a crucible that hardened his resolve. Survival was not enough. He would become the master of destiny, not just his own, but of millions. In the crucible of the steppe, where life was as fragile as the frost and as brutal as the blade, Temujin began to unify the tribes of Mongolia, not by mere persuasion, but by fire, steel, and vision. The Mongols were not a nation. They were a mosaic of warring clans, bound by blood, but divided by ambition. For centuries, no single Khan had managed to subdue the others. Temujin changed that. He introduced meritocracy into tribal hierarchy, elevating allies not by noble birth, but by loyalty and ability. He restructured Mongol society, demanding loyalty to the Khan over the clan. It was revolutionary, and it was ruthless. Those who opposed him were crushed. Those who joined him found order in chaos. By 1206, in a Kurultai, a great tribal council held near the Anan River Temujin, was proclaimed Genghis Khan. Universal ruler? It was not a symbolic title. He now commanded the most disciplined and deadly nomadic army the world had ever seen. His soldiers were horsemen first, warriors second, and ghosts always. Mounted on stocky, tireless Mongolian ponies, they rode faster than rumor. Each man carried multiple bows, hundreds of arrows, and lived in the saddle for days. With their hardened sinew bows, they could loose arrows at full gallop with lethal precision. They struck not in large, cumbersome formations, but in lightning raids feints, flanks, and traps choreographed with terrifying precision. But brute force alone did not explain the Mongol onslaught. Genghis Khan was not just a warlord, he was a strategist, a reformer, and a master psychologist. He used terror not just as aftermath, but as policy. Entire cities were razed not for resistance, but to serve as warnings. Survivors, if any, were sent ahead eyes hollow. Voices broke into whisper of the destruction that followed defiance. The steppe had given birth to empires before Scythians, Huns, Turks, but none had fused military brilliance with administrative vision like Genghis Khan, as he turned his gaze outward from the tribes of the Mongolian plateau to the civilizations that ringed at his ambition revealed itself to be boundless. First came the Xi kingdom in northwestern China, then the Jin dynasty to the east. But it was not enough. His lieutenants, blood-bound generals like Subutai, Jib, and Kublai spread like wildfire across Asia. The Mongol Empire began to expand not as a border, but as a floodplain. By 1219, Genghis Khan stood at the edge of the Islamic world. The Khwarezmian Empire, rich, sprawling, and arrogant, controlled much of Persia and Central Asia. When its Shah murdered a Mongol trade delegation, Genghis unleashed his fury. What followed was not a war, but an annihilation. Cities like Bukhara and Samarkand, once jewels of Islamic civilization, were reduced to dust. Tens of thousands were slaughtered, libraries burned, and rivers ran red. The Mongol storm had begun, and it was headed west. Beneath the scorched skies of Central Asia, where the Silk Roads twisted like veins through desert and oasis, civilization met its reckoning. From 1219 to 1221, the Mongol conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire was not a campaign, it was an extinction. Shah Muhammad II of Khwarezm had underestimated the fury he invited when he allowed the execution of Genghis Khan's ambassadors. Diplomacy, in Mongol custom, was sacred. Killing emissaries was an unforgivable sin, and Genghis did not forget. In response, the Mongols crossed the vast Kizilkum Desert, moving faster than any army of the age could dream. The Shah fled from city to city, a phantom monarch watching his empire disintegrate beneath him. In Bukhara, Genghis entered the Friday mosque and addressed the terrified citizens. "I am the punishment of God," he declared. "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." These words, uttered in the heart of Islamic scholarship, sent a shockwave through the Muslim world. The city was burned. Survivors, if spared, were turned into slaves or drafted into the Mongol war machine. Samarkand fell soon after. Despite its walls and its soldiers, the city could not withstand the Mongol siegecraft engineers recruited from China and Persia, operated advanced catapults, siege towers, and incendiaries. When the gates broke, the slaughter began. Chroniclers spoke of pyramids of skulls left as monuments to Mongol wrath. It wasn't just conquest, it was psychological warfare. Precision targeted to ensure that resistance elsewhere would crumble before the first arrow flew. Meanwhile, the Shah died a fugitive in a desolate island on the Caspian Sea. His son, Jalal al-Din, tried to regroup. At the Battle of the Indus in 1221, he faced Genghis Khan directly. The battle was fierce, and for a moment, the Shah's son even impressed the Mongol commander with his bravery. But bravery was not enough. Jalal al-Din was defeated and fled across the river into India. Genghis did not follow, not because he couldn't, but because his eye now turned elsewhere. Having dismantled an empire in 2 years, Genghis Khan began to reshape his realm. Governors were installed, trade routes secured, and a pony express system, the yam, was laid across the steppes, enabling near-constant communication across a growing dominion. It was control through velocity. No empire in history had ever moved so fast or coordinated so well across such distances. But even as Genghis consolidated the heart of Asia, his generals were already riding west. In 1223, Subutai and Jib led a reconnaissance force that penetrated deep into the Caucasus, defeating a coalition of Georgians and Alans. Their goal was not conquest, but knowledge maps, alliances, weaknesses. But when the Kipchaks of the steppe sought help from the Kiev and Rus, the Mongols struck with lethal clarity at the Battle of the Kalka River. Mongol tactics reached their most elegant form. Feigned retreat, encirclement, psychological exhaustion. Every page of their war doctrine unfolded like clockwork. The Kievan princes were lured into pursuit, stretched thin, and then annihilated. The Mongols captured the Rus commanders and executed them by crushing their bodies under wooden planks reportedly, while their captors feasted above. Brutality, once again, was message as much as method. And then they vanished. Like a storm that had passed, the Mongol army returned east. But the memory of their advance haunted Europe. Their speed, their silence, their inhuman efficiency. These were not men, the stories said, but devils on horseback. While Europe prepared for invasion, Genghis Khan returned to Mongolia. Age was creeping upon him. Though he remained a god in the saddle, the wear of decades of battle marked his body. In 1227, during a campaign against the Western Shua, he died likely from internal injuries after a fall from his horse. His death, however, was hidden. His body was carried back in secret, the road cleared by execution. According to legend, one, likely rooted in some truth, his funeral escort killed every soul they met to protect the sanctity of the burial. Genghis Khan's tomb remains unfound, swallowed by the steppes that had birthed him. But his empire did not die with him. In fact, it was just beginning. He had divided his realm among his sons, each now a Khan in their own right, but all subordinate. To the supreme Khan, a position passed to his son Gedai. Under Gedi's command, the Mongol advance resumed, this time toward the heart of Europe. In 1236, the Mongols returned to the west, not as a scouting force, but as a storm front of annihilation, led by Beta Khan and the incomparable general Subutai. They descended upon the Volga Bulgars, then the Rus principalities. This time, there would be no retreat. One by one, the cities of Kiev and Rus fell. Ryazan, Vladimir, Suzdal names etched in fire and blood. The Mongols employed Chinese siege technology, Persian engineers, and brutal Mongol discipline. In 1240, Kiev, the heart of Orthodox Christianity in Eastern Europe, was reduced to rubble. Chroniclers wrote that the streets were impassable from corpses. The Mongol Empire now stretched from the Yellow Sea to the Carpathians. Europe was next. And still, no one could stop them. The winter of 1241 was bitter in Central Europe. But it was not the cold that struck terror into the hearts of kings and peasants alike. It was the approach of the Mongols. By now, tailies of the horsemen from the east had traveled farther than their arrows. They were called Tartars, after Tartarus, the hell of ancient myth. They came not as an army, but as an apocalypse. In Hungary, Poland, and the Holy Roman Empire, nobles scrambled to raise defenses, forging alliances in desperation. Yet it was too late. In March, the Mongols struck Poland. At Legnica, a European coalition was annihilated. The Mongols, using smokescreens and feigned retreats, lured the knights into disarray. The elite Teutonic and Polish cavalry, armored in steel and pride, were shattered by superior coordination and mobility. The Duke of Silesia was decapitated, his head paraded on a spear. Weeks later, at the Battle of Mohi on the Sajo River, Hungary fell. King Bela IV had rallied tens of thousands, backed by knights and crossbowmen. But against Subutai's genius, numbers meant nothing. He feigned an attack on the bridge while building a second crossing in secret. Then, striking from both flanks with catapults, fire arrows, and disciplined cavalry, he crushed the Hungarian army in a two-pronged pincer. It was not a victory. It was an eresure. By the end of 1241, the road to Vienna, perhaps even to Rome, lay open. Panic gripped the continent. Christendom, fractured by petty feuds and papal intrigues, had no answer to this existential threat. The Mongols, it seemed, were unstoppable. And then, as suddenly as they had come, a vanished dot in December of that same year, Gedi Khan died in Karakorum, the imperial capital in Mongolia. According to Mongol law, the royal family and top generals were required to return for the Kurultai, the sacred council, to elect the next great Khan. Beta Khan, poised to sweep into Western Europe, halted his advance. The thunder of hooves faded into silence. It was not mercy that saved Europe. It was a funeral. The Mongol Empire did not fracture immediately. Under subsequent Khans like Mandi and the legendary Kublai, it expanded even further into China, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Yet as the generations passed, the unified storm splintered. Language, faith, and geography pulled the empire apart into four major khanates: the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. Still, the legacy of Genghis Khan was not measured merely in territory. It was carved into the bones of Eurasian civilization. Trade boomed under Mongol rule. The Pax Mongolica, a period of relative stability and open routes, allowed goods, ideas, and people to flow freely from Venice to Beijing. Marco Polo would travel to Kublai Khan's court. Arabic numerals and Chinese gunpowder moved westward. Paper, printing, medicine, and astronomy crisscrossed the empire's arteries. But so too did the Black Death, the plague, traveling along. The same Silk Roads and trade networks that the Mongols secured would decimate Europe. By the mid-14th century, another kind of storm, invisible and indiscriminate. The Mongols had shattered the old order. In the Muslim world, the fall of Baghdad in 1258 to Hulagu Khan marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate, one of Islam's greatest empires. In Russia, the Mongol yoke reshaped the trajectory of Slavic states, delaying unification, but eventually fueling a centralized tsardom under Moscow. In China, the rise of the Yuan dynasty would leave lasting marks on governance, art, and infrastructure. Yet the Mongols themselves, after generations of assimilation and excess, began to fade. By the 5th-10th century, their empire had fragmented beyond repair. Some khanates fell to local revolts, others to external invasions. What remained was memory etched into chronicles, bones, and ruins. But Genghis Khan's shadow endures. He was a man who rose from nothing, who turned tribal warfare into empire building, who welded the bow, the law, and the sword into a single doctrine of conquest. He rewrote the rules of warfare, not just with terror, but with vision. And while his methods were merciless, his impact was undeniable. The world he rode into no longer exists. But the world he left behind still bears his hoofprints. Thus ended the chapter of fire and thunder, the storm from the steppes that reshaped the earth. And from the embers of this empire, new powers would rise. In the dawn of the 13th century, Baghdad stood not merely as a city, but as a living testament to the heights of human civilization. Nestled on the banks of the Tigris River, it was a beacon of art, philosophy, astronomy, and architecture, a crown jewel in the diadem of the Islamic Golden Age. Scholars from Samarkand to Cordoba whispered its name with reverence. Merchants marveled at its opulent bazaars, where silks rustled like wind over desert dunes and perfumes wafted from glass vials shaped like teardrops. Astronomers plotted the heavens from its observatories. Physicians pioneered treatments in its hospitals. And in the grand house of wisdom Beit al-Hikmah, ancient Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge had been translated, debated, and expanded upon by minds who saw no contradiction between faith and reason. This was Baghdad, the city of peace, Madinat al-Salam. But by the mid-13th century, storm clouds gathered beyond the eastern horizon, and they bore hooves. Far across the steppes, From the chill winds of the Mongolian plateau, a new force had risen one that respected neither civilization nor creed, only submission. Genghis Khan had died, but his blood still coursed through the veins of his descendants. His grandson, Hulagu Khan, had inherited not only a lineage of conquest, but a divine mandate, at least as he saw it, tasked by his brother, the great Khan. Monji, Hulagu's mission was clear: extend Mongol dominion into the Islamic heartlands, crush all who stood in the path of empire, and destroy the heretical sect of the Nizari Ismailis, the infamous assassins who had long haunted the mountains of Persia. The Mongols advanced like a tide of steel and ash. First, the fortress of Alamet fell, its once impregnable walls shattered by Chinese siege engineers brought west for this very purpose. The assassins, masters of stealth and terror, were exterminated in their mountain strongholds. One by one, Persian cities capitulated or were annihilated. Tributes flowed. Blood flowed more freely. By 1257, Hulagu had reached the edges of Mesopotamia, and Baghdad, that ancient metropolis, stood exposed like a candle flickering in the wind. Caliph al-Mustasim, 37th and final Abbasid ruler, presided over a court of elegance, but also decay. The once proud Abbasid Caliphate had long since lost its political teeth. Its spiritual authority remained, yes, but its armies were weak, its alliances fractured, and its court riven with bureaucratic squabbles and miscalculations. The Caliph, hesitant and indecisive, gambled on diplomacy over defense. He believed Baghdad, sacred in its heritage, would be spared. Surely, no rational conqueror would burn the cradle of so much knowledge, so much history. But Hulagu Khan was no rational conqueror in the Islamic sense. He was the sign of an empire built on ash and ruin. He had seen the smoldering cities of Khorazm and Niskapur. He had personally overseen the leveling of Ray and Merv, and Baghdad to him was no exception. In late 1257, he sent a letter to the Caliph demanding surrender. The response was fatal. Al-Mustasim refused, and so began the death march of Baghdad. From the north and east, the Mongol army poured in. Estimates vary, but perhaps 150,000 men cavalry, siege crews, engineers swarmed the region. Hulagu had not come alone. He was accompanied by Christian allies from Armenia and Georgia, Chinese engineers skilled in the art of counterweight trebuchets, and a host of auxiliary forces whose sole loyalty was terror. The siege began in January 1258. For the people of Baghdad, it felt like a dream turning to nightmare. The Mongols built palisades and trenches, cutting the city off from food and reinforcements. They used the Tigris as both blockade and weapon. Massive siege engines hurled boulders, firepots, and diseased carcasses over the walls. Within days, outer defenses collapsed. Panic spread through the city like wildfire. Still, the Caliph hesitated. He had no allies nearby. Cairo's Mamluks were distant, the Seljuks fractured, the Ottomans yet unborn. No one came. On February 10th, 1258, the walls of Baghdad fell, and history cracked open. What happened next would haunt the Islamic world for generations. The gates of Baghdad were breached under a pall of smoke and thunder. Hulag's army poured through, and with it, the soul of the city began to unravel. There was no distinction between soldier and citizen. The Mongols descended like a plague upon the population, merciless, calculated, relentless. For 7 days and nights, Baghdad was subjected to a massacre unlike anything seen in the Islamic world since the Prophet's time. It is said the streets ran red with blood. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Minarets crumbled. Mosques were looted. Homes set ablaze. The shrieks of the dying mingled with the roar of collapsing domes and crackling fire. There was no sanctuary, not in the mosques, not in the hospitals, not in the schools. Priests, physicians, poets, and paupers all met the same fate. But for the Islamic world, the deepest wound was intellectual. The House of Wisdom, jewel of the Abbasid era, repository of centuries of human knowledge, was targeted and obliterated. Hulagu, though not illiterate himself, had no use for books. The Mongol view of warfare made no allowance for preservation. Books were tossed into the Tigris River in such numbers that, as one account claims, the waters ran black with ink for days. Thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, and medicine vanished into oblivion. The Tigris, once lifeblood of the city, now carried the corpses of scholars. It was a symbolic death as much as a literal one. With the burning of Baghdad, a torch of human knowledge was extinguished, plunging a region into intellectual darkness from which it would struggle to recover for centuries. And still, amidst the carnage, the Caliph remained alive. For a brief moment, Al-Mustasim was spared. Brought before Hulagu in chains, he was not met with mercy but mockery. The Mongols, ever theatrical in punishment, are said to have wrapped him in a carpet and trampled him under horse, ensuring that no royal blood would be spilled, in accordance with Mongol superstition. Other sources claim he starved to death, locked in a tower with treasure he could no longer use. Whatever the manner, the message was clear. The Caliphate was dead. After over 500 years, the Abbasid line, the symbolic heart of the Muslim world, had ended not with a diplomatic succession or internal revolt, but with a foreign sword and a city in ruin. The psychological aftershock was vast. In the mosques of Damascus, scholars wept openly. In Cairo, panic rippled through the Mamluk court. Even in faraway Delhi, Baghdad's fall sent tremors. The capital of Islam, home to caliphs, poets, and polymaths, was no more, and it had not fallen in a noble siege between rival Muslim dynasties. It had been wiped from the earth by non-believers. It seemed, to many, that Islam itself was on the verge of annihilation. But history is not linear, and amidst the fire, seeds were sown. In Cairo, a new class of rulers had emerged, the Mamluks, warrior slaves turned sultans. Led by Sultan Qutuz, a man forged in battle and ambition, the Mamluks watched the Mongol advance with both fear and resolve. They understood that after Baghdad, Damascus was next, and then inevitably, Egypt. They also knew the Mongols believed themselves invincible, and why not? In less than a generation, the sons of Genghis had conquered lands from Korea to Kiev, from Siberia to Samarkand. Empires fell before them like grass before a scythe. The Mongol army was a machine of coordination and psychological warfare, blending Chinese siegecraft, Persian engineering, and Mongolian cavalry into a terrifying symphony of destruction. But there was a flaw in the Mongol juggernaut. Their empire, vast as it was not a monolith. It was stretched thin, ruled by brothers and cousins with rival ambitions. Hulag's forces, after Baghdad, were forced to pull back. News came that the great Khan Mandi had died, and Hulagu had to return east to secure his claim. Only a portion of the army remained in the Levant, under the command of Kitbuka, a Christian Mongol general. It was this sliver of the Mongol horde that now threatened the rest of the Muslim world. And so, the battle lines shifted from Baghdad's ruins to the fields of Syria. By mid-1259, the Mamluks prepared for war, not merely for their survival, but for the soul of the Islamic world. Qutuz sent envoys, mustered troops, and formed a fragile alliance with rival emirs. Among them was Baibars, a brilliant general with fire in his blood and vengeance in his heart. Together, they would soon march north, toward destiny. But the shadow of Baghdad still loomed, because in the minds of every Muslim alive, the burning of that ancient city was more than an event. It was a wound, a cosmic violation. And whatever would follow victory redemption, or further ruin would be measured against that inferno. The caliphate was gone. Its flame had been snuffed out. Now, the question remained, could anything rise from its ashes? From the smoldering remains of Baghdad, the Islamic world staggered forward, blinded by grief, trembling with rage, and groping for answers in the silence left behind. The fall of the Abbasid Caliphate was more than the death of a dynasty. It was the rupture of continuity, the breaking of a spiritual thread that had bound the Muslim world together for half a millennium. No longer would Friday sermons resound with the name of a Baghdad caliph. No longer would the black banner of the Abbasids fly above the lands of Islam, claiming a lineage to the Prophet himself. In the east, the Mongols tightened their grip. Cities that had once sent students and scholars to Baghdad now paid tribute in gold or blood. Persia fell under the sway of the newly formed Ilkhanate, with Hulagu at its head. It was a Mongol dominion, but a Persian administration beneath. Even conquerors needed the ink of scribes once the fire of war had passed. Yet even here, amidst the foreign yoke, change was taking root. In time, the Ilkhanate itself would transform. Though Hulagu remained a Nestorian Christian, his descendants would gradually turn toward Islam. Within a few generations, Mongol rulers who had once raised mosques would commission them. They would speak Persian, read Arabic, and fund madrasas where once there had been slaughter. History, ever the alchemist, turned conquest into assimilation. But in 1258, none of that could be foreseen. To the west, the Mamluks prepared for war. Their message was clear. Islam would not perish without resistance. In 1260, a Mongol envoy arrived in Cairo bearing an ultimatum: surrender or suffer Baghdad's fate. Sultan Qutuz responded not with diplomacy, but execution. The heads of the envoys were hung from the gates of Cairo a clear reply written in flesh. What followed would become legend. In the verdant valley of Ain Jalut, near modern-day Northern Israel, the Mamluk and Mongol armies met in September 1260. The earth shook under the thunder of hooves. Arrows blackened the skies. For the first time in history, the Mongols were decisively defeated in open battle. Kitbuko was captured and executed. It was not just a military victory. It was a psychological exorcism. Baghdad had fallen, yes, but Islam had not. The caliphate was dead, but the faith remained defiant. The Mamluks would claim guardianship of the Muslim world, and though they could never restore what had been lost, they would ensure that the Mongol advance went no further. Still, the shadow of Baghdad lingered. In the years that followed, a symbolic caliphate was resurrected in Cairo, a faint echo of the Abbasid line. A distant relative of al-Mustasim was installed, cloaked in ceremonial robes, stripped of power but endowed with spiritual legitimacy. The Mamluks, clever in their politics, understood the power of symbolism. The caliph might no longer rule, but his presence sanctified their rule. The libraries lost in Baghdad could never be recovered. The scholars who perished could not be replaced. But the thirst for knowledge, though wounded, endured. From Andalusia to Timbuktu, from Cairo to Delhi, new centers of learning would rise. Baghdad's fall served as both tragedy and catalyst. It revealed the vulnerability of centralized power and the peril of intellectual complacency. It taught a lesson in resilience, that even when cities burn and dynasties collapse, ideas, if scattered wisely, can survive. The Tigris, over time, ran clear again. The broken walls of Baghdad were rebuilt. Its bazaars reopened. A city cannot forget a wound like 1258, but it can learn to breathe through the scar. In the centuries to come, travelers would walk those streets, unaware of the bones beneath their feet, the ashes embedded in its soil, or the ink that once stained the river's currents. But in the collective memory of a civilization, Baghdad's burning would remain a solemn hymn, a reminder of both brilliance and hubris. of glory and ruin. And in the long arc of history, the fall of Baghdad would not mark the end of the Islamic story, but its transformation from its ashes. New powers would rise, and far to the west, in the heart of Anatolia, a fledgling tribe of Turks obscure, disciplined, and devout was already laying the foundations for something far greater God. Thus began the slow drumbeat toward a new empire. The world would come to know it by a different name, the Ottomans. In the waning light of the 13th century, the Islamic world trembled. To the east, the Mongol tide swallowed cities whole, their iron hooves pounding across Persia and Iraq, leaving behind smoldering silence. To the west, Crusader kingdoms still clung to fragments of the Levant, their cathedrals casting long shadows over lands once ruled by caliphs. Between these storm fronts stood Egypt, battered yet unbowed, ruled not by kings or caliphs, but by warriors once bought and sold. They were the Mamluks, a name that once meant owned property, slaves, chattel. But these were no ordinary bondsmen. Ripped from the steppes of Central Asia or the mountain passes of the Caucasus, they were Turkic Kipchaks and Circassians boys of sharp bone and keen eye, traded like livestock across Black Sea ports and funneled into the beating heart of Cairo. There, beneath the minarets and domes of a city drenched in sun and sand, they were remade not merely in body, but in soul. Egypt had long relied on slave soldiers, but the Mamluk system perfected the concept. Upon arrival, the young recruits were stripped of all identity. Their languages were forbidden, their pasts erased. What remained was a blank slate upon which only discipline, loyalty, and the way of the sword were etched. In special military schools called Khalsa institutions, they were trained in archery, horsemanship, tactics, and above all obedience. These were not slaves in chains. They were soldiers in spirit. And after years of brutal training, they were granted manumission. But their bond to the state and to one another ran deeper than any legal document. Their society became a military caste. To rise in its ranks was not a matter of birth, but merit. The strongest, sharpest, and most cunning would rise, and the greatest among them would eventually rule. In 1250, the Ayyubid dynasty, descendants of Saladin, fell to internal strife and external pressure. Into the power vacuum stepped the Mamluks, not with royal claims or ancient titles, but with drawn swords and the loyalty of Cairo's barracks. Shajar al-Dur, a former slave consort turned queen, had briefly ruled after her husband's death, but the idea of a woman on the throne scandalized many. The Mamluks, seizing the moment, executed their rivals and declared a new sultan, Aybek, a Mamluk officer. Thus, a new era dawned, not of caliphs or dynasties, but of generals born in bondage. Yet the threat from the east was growing. By 1258, the Mongols under Hulagu Khan stormed Baghdad, the spiritual heart of the Muslim world. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had reigned since 750 CE, was extinguished in a week of fire and blood. Libraries burned, scholars slaughtered. The Caliph himself, a descendant of the Prophet's uncle, was rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, lest his sacred blood be spilled by hand to the Islamic world. It was not merely a defeat. It was an apocalypse, and the Mongols were not finished. Their next target was Syria, and beyond it Egypt. The newly born Mamluk Sultanate faced annihilation. But out of this crucible emerged a leader destined for legend. His name was Saif ad-Din Qutuz. He had once been a slave, himself some say sold after Mongol raids shattered his native lands. But he had risen fast, his mind as sharp as his sword. Pragmatic, unflinching, and iron-willed, Qutuz was no courtly aristocrat. He understood what was coming, and he knew that only fire could meet fire. In Cairo, the atmosphere turned electric. The mosques buzzed with sermons of resistance. Blacksmiths labored day and night forging blades and arrowheads. In the Mamluk barracks, veterans whispered tales of Mongol savagery to the younger recruits. There would be no retreat. If Egypt fell, the Hijaz and the holy cities would follow. This was not merely a political conflict. It was a war for the soul of Islam. As Hulagu Khan's forces surged toward Damascus, a Mamluk envoy was sent to negotiate. The Mongols responded by executing the delegation, decapitating them and nailing their heads to the gates of Aleppo. The message was clear. Qutuz had already begun to assemble the army. Among those answering the call was Baibars, a brilliant commander with a personal vendetta against the Mongols. Years earlier, he had tasted defeat at their hands. Now he would have his reckoning. Together, Qutuz and Baibars prepared to march, leaving behind the safety of the Nile and pushing into the open plains of Palestine. Ahead of him waited the Mongols. Behind them, an entire civilization held its breath. In the summer of 1260, the land of Palestine lay parched beneath a cruel sun. The earth cracked underfoot, the winds blew dry and dust-laden, and the air smelled faintly of iron and sweat. Into this scorched land marched the Mamluks, disciplined, silent, armored riders under the green banner of Egypt. Their destination, a small valley near the town of Ain Jalut, meaning Spring of Goliath, nestled in the Jezreel Valley. It was here that destiny would be. Written in blood, the Mongol horde that approached from the north was not led by Hulagu Khan himself. He had retreated to the steppes upon news of the great Khan Mongdik's death, but by his trusted general, Kitbuka, a Nestorian Christian of immense reputation. The Mongol army, though reduced in number, still carried the terror of Baghdad's fall on its banners. And now it pressed into Syria with brutal efficiency. Damascus had already fallen. Cities surrendered or burned. Across the Levant, no one had ever dared stand against the Mongols and live to tell the tale. But Qutuz would not bend. In Cairo, he had summoned every able soldier. The Mamluk army was not large, perhaps 20,000 at best, but it was united by code, loyalty, and the fire of revenge. Qutuz knew that if Egypt waited behind its walls, it would suffer the same fate as Baghdad. Instead, he would take the fight to the Mongols. Bold, unprecedented, and for many unthinkable, yet Qutuz was not alone. At his side rode Baibars al-Bunduk Dari, a tactician forged in war, whose very name struck fear in Crusader and Mongol alike. Once enslaved by the Kipchaks, he had risen by merit and cunning, and now he would have his moment. The two commanders devised a plan not of brute force, but of tactical brilliance. They chose the narrow valley of Ain Jalut for its geography, flanked by hills. The terrain limited the Mongols' feigned maneuverability. Baibars was tasked with leading the vanguard, drawing Kitbuka's forces in. The rest of the Mamluk army would remain hidden behind the hills, waiting, watching, breath held. On September 3rd, 1260, as dawn broke over the valley, the trap was sprung. Baibars charged, first swift, loud, ferocious. His cavalry clashed with the Mongol front lines in a whirlwind of sabers and hooves. Then, in a calculated feint, he retreated. Kitbuka, smelling victory, took the bait. The Mongols gave chase, thundering into the gorge, their formation unraveling as they pushed deeper. And then, from the hills, came the sound that would echo through history. The Mamluks struck. From both flanks, hidden forces surged down, slamming into the Mongol lines. Arrows blackened the sky. Swords flashed like sunlit rivers. Horses screamed. Men died by the hundred. The valley became a crucible of chaos and dust. In the heart of it all rode Qutuz, his armor glinting, his blade red. When the Mamluk lines wavered, he is said to have ripped off his helmet and shouted, "O Muslims, fight for your religion." His cry cut through the din like a war trumpet. The Mamluk ranks rallied. They pushed harder. Kitbuka fought with fury, but the noose had tightened. His forces, caught and overwhelmed, collapsed. The Mongol general was captured. Qutuz ordered his execution, that it was the first decisive defeat of the Mongol army in open battle. And it shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility. For the first time in half a century, the storm had been turned. The aftermath was immediate and immense. Damascus, having watched from afar, expelled its Mongol garrison and opened its gates to the Mamluks. Qutuz entered the city not as a conqueror, but a liberator. For the people of Syria, he was the sword that had shielded Islam, but victory bred tension. Baibars, though instrumental in the triumph, had ambitions of his own. The glory of Ain Jalut had electrified Egypt, and some feared that Qutuz, now hailed as the savior of Islam, might consolidate power indefinitely. Promises made were being reconsidered. Baibars, once promised governorship of Aleppo, found his request delayed, and then came betrayal. On the return journey to Cairo, while passing through the plains of Al-Salihiyah, Qutuz was ambushed by conspirators among them, Baibars himself. The Sultan was stabbed and killed. His reign had lasted only a year, but in that single year he had changed the fate of a civilization. Baibars seized power almost immediately, declaring himself Sultan. He mourned Qutuz publicly, praised him in mosques, and buried him with honors. But few were fooled. The Mamluk throne had passed from one sword to another, and now it would be Baibars who would shape the empire to come. From the bloodied fields of Ain Jalut to the minarets of Cairo, the Mamluk Sultanate emerged as the last bastion of the Islamic world, defiant, unyielding, and now led by a man forged entirely by war, Sultan Baibars. The once enslaved Kipchak warrior now stood alone at the summit of power. Ruthless when needed, shrewd always, Baibars did not inherit a legacy, he carved it. He ruled not as a king of noble descent, but as a general with unmatched cunning and vision. And from the moment he gripped the reins of state, Baibars began molding the Mamluk Sultanate into a fortress that would endure for centuries. His first act was symbolic, but essential. With the Abbasid Caliphate destroyed by the Mongols, the Islamic world lacked a unifying spiritual figure. Baibars revived the Caliphate in Cairo, installing a distant Abbasid relative as a ceremonial caliph under Mamluk protection. This move was political genius. He bound religious legitimacy to military authority. Cairo, no longer just a provincial capital, now claimed to be the heart of Sunni Islam. But Baibars was not content with symbolism alone. He reorganized the state with military precision. Roads were improved for rapid troop movement. Watchtowers dotted the Syrian frontier. Fortresses were expanded and reinforced, particularly along the vulnerable coastline and against Mongol entry points. The army was placed under tighter central command, and the recruitment of new Mamluk slave boys, trained from youth, was accelerated. These newcomers, though manumitted, owed absolute allegiance to the Sultan who trained them. The Mamluk system became a self-perpetuating machine, each generation producing new elite warriors who would protect the throne and, eventually, claim it. Yet Baibars' rule was not merely defensive. From 1261 onward, he launched campaigns of reconquest driven by vengeance, religious fervor, and statecraft. He targeted the Crusader strongholds along the Levantine coast. With patience and fury, he dismantled the remnants of the Latin kingdoms. Caesarea, Arsuf, Safad, Jaffa, city after city fell to his armies. He used sappers to undermine walls, psychological warfare to break defenders, and brutal precision to ensure no fortress would rise again. In 1268, Antioch, one of the most fortified and storied cities in Crusader hands, was taken and thoroughly razed. Its churches were emptied, its towers collapsed. The once mighty principality of Antioch ceased to exist. Baibars also confronted the Mongols head-on. In 1271, he marched into Syria again to repel further Mongol incursions, securing Mamluk authority over the region. While he avoided the full-scale confrontation that defined Ain Jalut, he demonstrated that the Sultanate was no longer a reactive force. It was the dominant power of the eastern Mediterranean. Yet, for all his power, Baibars ruled with caution. He understood the fragility of his throne. He rotated governors frequently, ensured that no emir could grow too powerful, and kept the loyalty of the military caste through carefully managed patronage. He commissioned mosques, hospitals, caravanserais, building not just an empire of steel, but one of stone and soul. Under his reign, Cairo blossomed into a thriving center of Islamic scholarship, trade, and architecture. But Baibars was a man of contradiction, devout and pragmatic, generous and cruel. To his enemies, he showed no mercy. To his allies, he was dependable to the last. In many ways, he embodied the very paradox of the Mamluk order: slave soldiers ruling an empire, outsiders defending tradition. His death in 1277 came suddenly. Rumors swirled that he was poisoned. Others say he drank a cup of medicine too potent for even his iron will. Regardless, he died on the throne, unbeaten, his legacy firmly cemented. The Mamluk Sultanate, now fully realized, would endure for over 2 centuries, surviving the Mongols, outlasting the Crusaders, and even resisting the early Ottoman expansion. Cairo would remain the beating heart of Islam's military frontier, and its citadel, first fortified by Saladin, would watch over generations of warrior kings molded from the same ruthless code. Yet their system, built on brilliance and brutality, contained its own seeds of decline. Over time, merit gave way to politics. Emirs grew more ambitious. Corruption crept into the heart of the order. The very machine Baibars had perfected began to rust. But in its prime, the Mamluk Sultanate was a marvel of resilience, an empire born not of bloodlines, but of brotherhood, and battle. And it all began with slaves who defied fate. Thus ended the era of emergence, and began the age of empire. In the year 1260, the air above Cairo hung heavy with the dust of memory and the scent of tension. It was the eve of reckoning in the Islamic world, an age trembling beneath the thunderous hoofbeats of the Mongol horde. From the scorched plains of Central Asia to the banks of the Tigris, cities had fallen like wheat before the scythe. Baghdad, once the shining crown of the Abbasid Caliphate, had been reduced to ash and blood. Now the Mongol gaze turned westward toward Syria, and Egypt beyond. The Mongol Empire, under Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, had carved through the Islamic heartlands with terrifying ease. Hulag's campaign was not merely one of conquest, it was an execution. The house of Islam stood dismembered. Aleppo and Damascus had not yet fallen, but the roads were already cracking beneath the weight of fear. It was in this climate of dread and disarray that Cairo received a message. One unlike any other. It was carried not by traders or pilgrims, but by emissaries clad in brocade and arrogance. The Mongol delegation entered Cairo bearing a letter from Hulagu himself, sealed in silken wrapping, perfumed and precise. Yet its contents were soaked in venom. It did not offer alliance. It did not ask for negotiation. It was a command and ultimatum disguised as diplomacy. Submit to the will of the great Khan. It read, or face the fate of those who defied him. Sultan Saif ad-Din Qutuz stood on the precipice of decision. A former slave turned ruler, Qutuz had clawed his way to the throne of Egypt in a palace coup just months prior. His rise was born not of bloodline, but of survival. Hardened by years in the crucible of Mamluk politics, Qutuz was not a man to yield easily. And yet, Before him now stood the legacy of annihilated cities and the threat of total war. The Mamluk court fell into a stunned silence as the words of Hulagu echoed through its chambers. Around Qutuz, whispers formed like cracks in marble. Some called for compromise, for time. Others, including the formidable General Baibars al-Bunduk Dari, murmured of action, but their unity frayed beneath old rivalries. Baibars, a brilliant tactician and ruthless survivor of the Mongol sack of Baghdad, eyed Qutuz with both admiration and suspicion. Their alliance was necessity, not brotherhood. Outside the citadel, the streets of Cairo throbbed with a quiet fear. Traders spoke in hushed tones. Mosques echoed with prayers not just for peace, but for deliverance. For generations, Egypt had remained a bastion untouched by Mongol wrath. But now, that immunity seemed poised to shatter. Qutuz waited 3 days before responding. On the 4th, the Mongol envoys were summoned again to the palace courtyard. What happened next was a message clearer than any letter. The Sultan did not respond with ink. He responded with steel. One by one, the envoys were seized and beheaded. Their heads, bloodied and lifeless, were impaled above Cairo's gates. It was an act of defiance so stark that it echoed across continents. In the lexicon of Mongol warfare, to slay an emissary was to declare total war. Qutuz had made his choice. Egypt would not kneel, but war was not just waged on battlefields. It brewed in the spaces between loyalties. Even as the Sultan rallied his commanders, the bonds holding the Mamluk elite began to fray. Baibars, who had once fought the Mongols in Palestine, hungered not only for victory, but for power. The young Crusader states along the Levantine coast watched from their stone fortresses, uncertain whether to assist the Mongols, the Muslims, or simply survive. A fragile calculus emerged. Who was the greater threat? The horsemen from the east, or the rising power of a united Egypt? And so, beneath the golden dome of Cairo's citadel, as pigeons scattered and minarets shimmered in the desert sun, the countdown began not just to war, but to destiny. As spring waned into the furnace of summer, 1260 became a season not of harvest, but of reckoning. The silence that followed the beheading of the Mongol envoys was not peace, it was the breath before the storm. Sultan Qutuz knew the sands of time were shifting beneath him. Egypt had declared its refusal to submit. Now, the response from Hulagu Khan was all but inevitable. But fate, unpredictable and ruthless, turned its hand unexpectedly. In the distant Mongol court, far beyond the Euphrates. The death of the great Khan Mongi Halag's brother had rippled through the empire like a tremor through stone. Hulagu, compelled by succession politics and the need to secure his own position, withdrew a significant portion of his army eastward. What remained in the Levant was a force under his general, Kitbuka, a brilliant and brutal commander of Christian Nestorian background, left to maintain the Mongol grip on Syria.